Imagine spending your entire life building something with sweat, sleepless nights, and painful sacrifices only to finally achieve financial freedom and realize that the very people who should care for you see nothing but numbers in your bank account. I am Evelyn Whitmore, and for decades, I worked as if every second were a bet against time. I turned a small medical supply store into a multimillion-dollar empire. But when fate came knocking with a merciless diagnosis, advanced stage pancreatic cancer, I discovered that my greatest battle would not be against the disease but against my own daughter, Sandra, and her husband, Donald. They claimed to be concerned about my health. But the truth? They wanted every cent I had built. What they didn't know was that I was already several steps ahead. You might think it's radical to hide a fortune from someone who shares your blood. But as you follow this story, you'll understand that sometimes loving someone means not allowing that person to destroy you. And more than that, you'll see how an unexpected reunion with Miguel Santos, a lost love from 30 years ago, changed everything. Get ready to step behind the scenes of a calculated escape, a legal battle full of twists, and the transformation of a woman who chose to trade manipulation for freedom. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about money, it's about justice, starting over, and the courage to choose your own ending. Evelyn Whitmore had always believed her life was the result of calculated choices and tireless work. At 72, the former successful entrepreneur in the medical supply business no longer led board meetings or signed major contracts, but her eyes still carried the determination that had once built an empire. Her days now revolved around appointments, tests, and expensive medications that drained not only her savings but also her energy. It was on what seemed like an ordinary morning that Dr. Harrison, with a grave expression and steady voice, delivered the words that would change everything: advanced stage pancreatic cancer. The sentence came with harsh statistics: 6 to 18 months to live, depending on how she responded to treatment, and a recommendation to act quickly. Evelyn felt the weight of those words hit like a punch to the gut, but at the same time, a part of her shifted into the mode it always had in times of crisis, thinking in strategies. As she left the office, she walked to a nearby cafe and ordered chamomile tea that went untouched while her mind spun. What do I do with this time? She asked herself, knowing the disease was only part of the battle. The walk home felt longer than usual. The walls of her living room displayed photos of travels, achievements, and happy moments, but one in particular caught her eye: Sandra, her daughter, still a teenager, smiling beside Miguel Santos, a family friend who had left for Portugal decades ago. The memory was bittersweet. Sandra, now an adult, rarely showed up unless there was something in it for her, and Donald, her son-in-law, was even colder and more direct. Evelyn clearly remembered the large loans, the properties she'd given them, and even the life insurance money used to bail them out of financial trouble. None of it had ever been repaid, and on the few visits she received, the topics inevitably revolved around assets, inheritance, and real estate. Once, Donald even joked that at least the life insurance would be good for something someday. It hadn't sounded funny. As she organized her schedule of tests, Evelyn realized she might have to face cancer almost entirely alone. At the same time, she began to see clearly that she needed to protect not just her health but also her assets and her freedom. True friends drew closer with messages and acts of kindness, but her daughter and son-in-law seemed far more interested in controlling her decisions. Stories of financial abuse within wealthy families had always caught her attention, and now she realized her own home was not immune to family manipulation. On a silent night, she opened her old diary and wrote down every detail: the diagnosis, the doctor's words, her feelings, fears, and certainties. Writing brought unexpected relief, as if she were taking back the reins. Closing the diary, she made herself a promise she would not allow Sandra, Donald, or the disease itself to decide how her final chapters would be written. The next morning, as she made coffee, she felt something inside her shift. It wasn't blind optimism, but a quiet conviction. She would face treatment with the same discipline she had used to build her empire, and above all, she would make strategic decisions to ensure her legacy wouldn't be controlled by those who didn't deserve it. The illness might be ruthless, but Evelyn had faced worse battles before. And deep down, she knew this fight wouldn't be just against pancreatic cancer, but against everything and everyone that tried to steal from her the chance to end life on her own terms. Sandra had always been a complex presence in Evelyn's life. From a young age, her daughter showed an almost obsessive fascination with the lifestyle her mother had achieved through years of hard work. At first, Evelyn thought it was natural. What young person wouldn't want comfort, travel, and financial security? But over time, she realized there was a vast difference between admiration and dependency. Sandra rarely visited out of genuine affection. Most of the time, she arrived with requests disguised as urgent needs. And inevitably, Donald was at her side, delivering a rehearsed speech about how the help would be only temporary. Evelyn knew temporary for them meant permanent. Every act of generosity was turned into an eternal debt that would never be repaid. Houses, cars, trips, life insurance money, none of it had been returned, and the most painful part was the complete absence of gratitude. The emotional distance between mother and daughter didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, made up of countless small cuts. A forgotten birthday call, a rushed visit on important dates, messages answered only when it suited them. Evelyn wondered if she had gone wrong in raising her. Maybe she had been too lenient, trying to make up for the years she'd been absent, working tirelessly. Or maybe Sandra had simply chosen a path where love and money were too intertwined to separate. The fact was, every time she heard her daughter's voice on the phone, she braced herself for a request, not words of affection. Donald, on the other hand, never hid his pragmatic view of Evelyn. To him, she was an elderly woman with valuable assets and failing health, which meant a countdown to a sizable inheritance. Always polite but cold, he seemed to make a mental inventory every time he stepped into her house. He would comment on the furniture, ask about market values for her properties, and had even hinted that it would be easier if she sold the house and moved somewhere smaller. It wasn't hard to imagine those suggestions came with a precise calculation of how much they could profit. Things grew even more tense after the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, when Sandra and Donald began visiting Evelyn unusually often. At first, she thought it might be concern. But it only took the first conversation to realize their focus wasn't her health, but future plans for her treatment and the management of her assets. "Mom, you need to think about what's best for you," Sandra said, with a tone of false sweetness. But beneath the words was a clear proposal: sell the house and move in with them or to a senior community. Evelyn immediately understood what that meant: losing control of her decisions and watching her assets slowly drained away. And so it went, a silent war of control, played with smiles and polite words, but with greed and strategy lurking underneath. Evelyn, however, was not about to surrender her independence, not to illness, and certainly not to them. It was almost amusing, Evelyn thought, how the survival instinct manifested in different ways. For her, surviving meant fighting for autonomy. For Sandra and Donald, it seemed to mean securing the inheritance before it was even theirs. This wasn't just a family conflict, it was a quiet game of manipulation. And, as a skilled strategist, Evelyn was already calculating her next moves. Allowing them to control her treatment would be like handing over the keys to the vault to people who only saw dollar signs. Deep down, Evelyn still wanted to believe Sandra could change, that there was a trace of genuine affection buried beneath that layer of self-interest. But each encounter served as a painful reminder that she might be facing something deeper, a long-standing pattern of financial and emotional abuse. The worst part was knowing she had, in some way, helped create the conditions for it to happen. After all, she was the one who had taught her daughter about power and money, but never about boundaries. The mounting tension made Evelyn act more cautiously. Conversations became measured, and details about her health and finances were carefully filtered. She had no intention of giving Sandra and Donald ammunition. At the same time, she realized that to protect her freedom, she needed to safeguard not just her assets but also prepare for a potential legal battle. That meant gathering documents, reviewing her will, and perhaps even cutting certain legal ties. It was a painful step, but a necessary one. Between medical appointments and sleepless nights, one thought kept growing stronger: maybe it was time to change the game completely. It was no longer just about preventing Sandra from controlling her life, it was about creating a plan to ensure that even after she was gone, her daughter and son-in-law could never profit from what she had built. And though she didn't yet have all the details, she knew the first move would be to keep the greatest secret of her life well hidden. The visit began with a cold hug and a smile that never reached the eyes. Sandra sat on Evelyn Whitmore's sofa as if settling in for a negotiation, while Donald, as always, remained standing, scanning the room with that calculating gaze, as if assessing the value of every object in sight. Evelyn knew something was coming, and she didn't have to wait long. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it would be best if you sold this house. It's too big for you alone, and you could use that money for more comfort," Sandra said, with a rehearsed tone of concern. Donald added that she could move in with them or into a well-equipped senior community. Evelyn smiled faintly, not in agreement, but because in that instant, she fully understood the true intention behind the proposal. It wasn't about comfort, it was about control. Selling the house would mean giving up her independence and handing them the perfect opportunity to manage and manipulate her decisions. Sandra's sweet tone clashed with the coldness Evelyn knew all too well. Her daughter spoke of safety and company, but avoided mentioning that in her house, Evelyn would have no say over anything. Donald, on the other hand, let slip that he could help organize the finances and ensure the money was well invested. Evelyn knew exactly what well invested meant in his vocabulary, well directed toward their own interests. The thought of being monitored and having to justify every expense to someone else felt like a prison sentence. She remembered stories of acquaintances who had trusted in the sweet words of children and sons-in-law, only to end up isolated and penniless. She had no intention of joining that list. While she listened, Evelyn let them talk, absorbing every word and mentally recording the most revealing phrases. It was almost like conducting a reverse interrogation. She didn't respond to avoid giving anything away, but she took note of everything for later use. Donald even suggested he could sell the house quickly for a fair market price, and Evelyn had to resist the urge to laugh. As a former businesswoman, she knew exactly how much every inch of that property was worth, and she knew that Donald's fare would mean undervaluing it to make their profit easier. The proposal for her to move into their home was framed as an act of love. Sandra described how she could care for her mother, help with appointments, organize medication, and even prepare meals. But Evelyn didn't need a translation in that context. Care meant supervise and control. She could picture herself waking up every day to Donald walking through the kitchen, giving her that auditor's glance, as if every slice of bread eaten was an expense to be approved. Worse still, she knew it wouldn't take long before they started debating which doctors, treatments, or expenses were worth it to prolong her life. Inside, Evelyn was already making decisions. There would be no house sale, no move, and certainly no surrender of power. To maintain control, she would have to act patiently, without raising suspicion. So she smiled, thanked them, and said she would think about it, all while quietly crafting a plan to protect herself. If Sandra and Donald thought they could manipulate her, they were about to find out they were dealing with someone who, despite her age and illness, still had a sharp mind and enough experience to turn the tables. At the end of the visit, Sandra tried to stress the urgency of the decision, saying the real estate market was favorable and it wasn't wise to miss the opportunity. Evelyn nodded, promising to consider it, but inside she knew she wouldn't sell, not even if the offer doubled. That house was more than walls and furniture. It was a symbol of her journey, her independence, and the freedom she still possessed. Losing it would mean opening the door to the kind of life she refused to have. As soon as the door closed and the silence returned, Evelyn allowed herself a deep breath. The feeling of being at the center of a siege grew clearer each day. But at the same time, the challenge awakened in her the same energy that had once driven her to succeed in business, the ability to think ahead, anticipate moves, and protect what was hers. She couldn't stop pancreatic cancer, but she could stop the wrong people from dictating the last years of her life. And for that, she was already storing away every detail of those conversations as key pieces in a bigger strategy. That night, alone in her kitchen, Evelyn made herself a cup of tea and let her mind work. What Sandra and Donald didn't know was that she already had resources tucked away, ones they couldn't even imagine existed. And, if she had her way, they never would. Their suspicious proposal only confirmed what she had already sensed: it was time to act with intelligence, because the war for her freedom had already begun. Evelyn Whitmore had always been discreet about her earnings, but in recent years that discretion had turned into absolute secrecy. When she sold her medical supply company for $8.2 million, she told no one, not even her daughter Sandra. The transaction was carried out meticulously, with airtight contracts protected by confidentiality clauses and the support of her trusted attorney, Robert Steinberg. To the outside world, it looked as if Evelyn had simply retired, without any massive payout involved. But the truth was that the money was safe, spread across investments and international accounts that no one except her and Robert knew existed. This wasn't about greed, it was about self-preservation. After years of watching her daughters and son-in-law's self-serving attitudes, Evelyn knew that if she wanted to live her final years in peace, she had to ensure her wealth never fell into the wrong hands. The decision to keep the fortune secret hadn't happened overnight, it had been built over years of incidents that left deep marks. Evelyn remembered every time Sandra asked for loans that were never repaid, or when Donald insisted on receiving advances for projects that never materialized. After the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, her instinct to protect what she had earned only intensified. It was as if the limited time ahead demanded flawless management of her resources, not only to cover expensive treatments but to secure the freedom to choose where and how she would live. Freedom and justice were values Evelyn valued more than any figure in a bank account. The $8.2 million represented far more than money, they were the sum of decades of struggle, sleepless nights, and risky decisions that had proven right. Evelyn thought of the fortune as a key in the right hands. It could open doors to experiences, travel, and moments of peace. In the wrong hands, it would become a weapon for financial abuse and family manipulation. Sandra and Donald were living proof of that risk. She knew that if they ever found out, they would invent every possible excuse to intervene in her life, from helping manage it to making sure the money was well used. But well used, in their vocabulary, meant used for their own benefit. To maintain the secret, Evelyn became even more cautious. She avoided discussing financial matters anywhere near people who might have contact with her daughter. Her transactions were handled discreetly, often through trusted intermediaries. At the same time, she crafted a public narrative that she lived only on her retirement and modest savings. That false image was her best defense. It kept prying eyes away and stopped inconvenient questions before they could be asked. If anyone mentioned the company sale, Evelyn would deflect, change the subject, or downplay the amount. She was a flawless actress when it came to protecting her assets. Robert Steinberg played a crucial role in this silent operation. As her attorney, he helped set up legal structures that shielded the fortune from any family access attempts. They created trusts, opened offshore accounts, and moved part of the assets into investments in Portugal, a country Evelyn had always admired and where she knew she could start over if necessary. Though she hadn't told anyone about this possibility yet, the seed of the idea was beginning to grow. Portugal could be more than just a vacation destination, it could be her refuge. The secrecy surrounding the fortune gave Evelyn a paradoxical sense of both vulnerability and power. Vulnerability, because if it were discovered, it could ignite a family war. Power, because it allowed her to decide her own future without asking for permission. Every time she thought about those protected $8.2 million, she felt a security no life insurance policy could provide. It was like having an invisible shield against any attempt at manipulation. That security allowed Evelyn to consider bold options. She could pay for the best medical treatment without depending on anyone, travel to the places she had always dreamed of, and most importantly, choose the ending to her own story. In that sense, the money was more than a resource, it was a weapon against the control Sandra and Donald were trying to impose on her. And the more she reflected on it, the more convinced she became that she had to keep this secret until the very last moment. At that point, Evelyn still didn't know exactly how she would use the fortune. But one thing was certain, it wouldn't be to feed the ambition of people who had never truly cared for her. The $8.2 million were her last card up her sleeve, a trump card ensuring that in the final game, she would still have the power to decide. And while time was against her because of the pancreatic cancer, Evelyn knew she would play smart because in life's chessboard, victory doesn't always go to the strongest, but to the one who makes the right moves at the right time. The reunion happened in a way almost cinematic, as if fate had decided to give Evelyn Whitmore a second chance at a critical moment. She was sitting in a small downtown cafe, trying to distract herself with a book while waiting for the results of a test, when she heard a deep male voice with a slight Portuguese accent calling her name. Looking up, she saw Miguel Santos standing before her, wearing the same warm smile she remembered from 30 years ago. He seemed to have aged well, the gray in his hair giving him an air of distinction, and his eyes still carrying that mix of serenity and intensity that had always captivated her. Evelyn felt a wave of nostalgia and surprise, as if a forgotten part of her life had suddenly resurfaced. Miguel didn't waste any time sitting down and asking how she was, but his gaze made it clear he wouldn't settle for superficial answers. Slowly, between sips of coffee and shared memories, Evelyn told him about the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, the visits heavy with ulterior motives from Sandra and Donald, and the weight of feeling surrounded by family manipulation. Miguel listened without interrupting, his eyes bright with a look that suggested he was already thinking of solutions. When she finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds before saying something that would change everything. Evelyn, you need freedom, and maybe Portugal is the place for that. She laughed, thinking he was joking, but Miguel was serious. He had returned to Portugal years earlier and built a quiet life in Cascais, surrounded by friends and a sea that seemed to heal any pain. There, you could start over, far from manipulation, far from greedy eyes. And if you want, I'll be there to make sure no one else controls your fate, he said with a firmness that made her shiver. The idea seemed too bold, almost impossible, but Evelyn felt a spark of hope. As the conversation went on, Miguel revealed he had contacts who could help her settle in quickly, from respected doctors to seasoned lawyers in the Portuguese system. He knew that pancreatic cancer treatment could be complemented by innovative therapies available at local clinics, and that the cost of living would allow Evelyn to live comfortably with the resources she had. More than that, Miguel spoke of quality of life, of waking up near the ocean, walking through historic streets, and feeling like she owned herself again. Practical as she was, Evelyn began asking detailed questions: how to transfer part of her assets, how to keep her secret from Sandra's ears, how to plan her departure without arousing suspicion. Patiently, Miguel answered each point, as if he had already imagined this plan long before they met again in that cafe. You don't have to disappear from life just from their sight, he said with a smile. That phrase echoed in her mind the rest of the day. When she returned home, Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about Portugal. The image of golden beaches, local markets, and cobblestone streets contrasted with the suffocating tension of her current life. For the first time since the diagnosis, she felt there was a way out that didn't just mean waiting for the worst. With Miguel by her side, the idea of starting over felt less like an escape and more like rescuing herself. In the days that followed, Miguel began calling her often, sending photos of Cascais, sharing stories of small daily joys, and even sending lists of doctors who could care for her. Evelyn realized that more than offering a change of scenery, he was offering her an emotional refuge. He was someone who saw in her more than just a patient or a potential heiress. He saw the strong woman she had always been, even if illness and circumstances had tried to overshadow her. The reunion rekindled something Evelyn hadn't felt in a long time: trust. Not just in Miguel, but in the possibility of choosing her own path. She knew that the decision to leave everything behind would require courage, planning, and absolute discretion. But with her fortune protected and Miguel's support, starting over in Portugal no longer felt like a distant fantasy. It felt like the logical next step for someone who had always known that freedom and justice are not given, they are earned. The idea of leaving didn't come as a sudden impulse, but as a plan that took shape day by day, fueled by exhaustion from manipulation and by the urgency that pancreatic cancer imposed. Evelyn Whitmore knew that to keep her freedom, she would have to act methodically, without leaving the slightest trace for Sandra or Donald. It was in this context that she sought out Robert Steinberg, her trusted attorney, to turn that fantasy into a concrete strategy. Robert, an experienced man with precise speech, listened in silence, already anticipating the careful moves that would be needed to protect her until the very end. The reunion rekindled something Evelyn hadn't felt in a long time: trust. Not only in Miguel, but in the possibility of choosing her own path. She knew that the decision to leave everything behind would require courage, planning, and absolute discretion. But with her fortune protected and Miguel's support, starting over in Portugal no longer seemed like a distant fantasy. It felt like the logical next step for someone who had always known that freedom and justice are not given, they are earned. The idea of leaving didn't come as a sudden impulse, but as a plan that solidified with each passing day, fueled by exhaustion from manipulation and by the urgency that pancreatic cancer imposed. Evelyn Whitmore knew that to keep her freedom, she would need to act methodically, without giving Sandra or Donald the slightest hint. It was in this context that she sought out Robert Steinberg, her trusted attorney, to turn that fantasy into a concrete strategy. Robert, an experienced man with precise speech, listened in silence as Evelyn laid out the situation, from the diagnosis to her daughter's suspicious proposal. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said that if she truly wanted to go through with it, she would need to make 3 key decisions: immediately revoke the power of attorney she had given Sandra, change her will, and transfer her funds to international accounts beyond the reach of any family member. The first step was almost symbolic, taking from her daughter the legal power to decide her life. Evelyn clearly remembered the day she had signed the power of attorney years ago, convinced she was simply preparing for a possible emergency. Now she realized that document was the key Sandra needed to control her completely. The revocation was discreetly registered, without any fuss, and with an extra clause ensuring that any attempt to contest it would be immediately invalidated. The second step, changing the will, required cold resolve. Evelyn had always imagined part of her fortune going to her daughter, but at that moment she decided the inheritance would have another destination: charitable institutions in Portugal, especially those focused on health care and assistance for the elderly. The third step, transferring the funds, was the most delicate. Robert advised that it be done in stages, using multiple financial institutions to avoid attracting attention. Part was sent to investments already established in Portugal, another to private accounts protected by confidentiality clauses. Evelyn oversaw each transaction with the attention of someone who had once managed multimillion-dollar businesses, feeling the same adrenaline as during a high-stakes negotiation. With each move, she felt more protected and closer to regaining full control over her life. While handling the legal and financial side, Evelyn also began shaping the logistics of her escape. She created a false narrative that she would be seeking experimental treatment in another country, choosing a destination that sounded exotic and convincing enough to distract Sandra. Meanwhile, Miguel Santos coordinated her reception in Portugal, arranging an apartment in Cascais, medical appointments with Dr. Carvalho, and even a plan to meet her at the airport without attracting attention. Every detail was designed so her disappearance would be seen as a simple health trip, not a definitive severing of ties. The emotional side, however, was more complex. Evelyn knew that leaving her home, her memories, and even some friends meant more than changing her address. It was letting go of an entire life to save what remained of her dignity. Nights grew longer, filled with mental lists and silent doubts. What if there wasn't enough time? What if the disease advanced too quickly? But then she would remember Sandra and Donald's cold visits, and fear would give way to conviction. Any risk was worth more than letting herself be imprisoned by them. The following days were a precise choreography of discrete actions. Evelyn hid important documents in a concealed folder, reviewed tickets and itineraries with Miguel, and kept conversations with her daughter light and superficial to avoid suspicion. She even invented non-existent symptoms to justify unusual medical appointments, creating an apparently chaotic routine that made tracking her movements difficult. With each new precaution, she felt the plan taking more shape. Shortly before leaving, Evelyn took one last walk through her house. She touched the walls, looked at the photos, breathed in the familiar air, and allowed herself a moment of melancholy. She knew she might never return, but she also knew that this farewell was necessary. It wasn't a flight out of fear, but a calculated move in the name of freedom. Closing the door for the last time, she felt no regret, only determination. The plane ticket to Lisbon was hidden inside a book on the shelf, like a treasure waiting for the right moment to be discovered. When she finally took it out, along with her passport, Evelyn knew this would be the most important trip of her life. A journey not just to another country, but to a new version of herself far from manipulation, financial abuse, and the invisible chains that had tried to imprison her for so long. Evelyn Whitmore's disappearance was not the result of improvisation, but of a carefully written script, where every detail served to mislead Sandra and Donald and protect her true destination. The first step was to create a false trail of medical treatment abroad. Using her business knowledge and her talent for crafting convincing narratives, Evelyn planted carefully calculated information. She told her daughter she had found a clinic specializing in experimental therapies for pancreatic cancer, located in a distant country with difficult access. She mentioned renowned doctors, innovative treatments, and even sent links and brochures that Robert Steinberg helped prepare, ensuring everything sounded legitimate. The second step was to maintain her normal routine for weeks to avoid arousing suspicion. Evelyn continued shopping at the local market, attending scheduled medical appointments, and even participating in small gatherings with acquaintances, all to create the impression that nothing unusual was happening. Meanwhile, Miguel Santos handled all the logistics in Portugal. He booked tickets under a slightly altered name to make tracking harder, hired a private transport service at Lisbon Airport, and rented a furnished apartment in Cascais, ready to receive her immediately. Packing also required strategy. Evelyn knew that leaving with too many suitcases would draw attention, so she chose to check only a medium-sized bag and send the rest of her most valuable belongings in separate shipments, using an international art and antiques transport service she already knew. Books, important documents, some jewelry, and sentimental items were packed and sent with generic descriptions to avoid third-party curiosity. That way, her departure would raise no suspicion, and by the time Sandra realized, everything would already be out of her reach. The silent farewell to the house was one of the hardest moments. Evelyn walked through each room as if taking mental photographs, memorizing the details that had always made that place more than just a property. She touched the furniture, breathed in the scent of the garden, and closed her eyes for a few seconds on the porch, feeling the wind on her face. But unlike other farewells she had experienced, this one didn't bring paralyzing sadness. On the contrary, there was a quiet excitement, the feeling of being on the verge of taking back control of her life. On the day of her departure, Evelyn woke up early, dressed simply, and carried only a handbag. She asked the driver hired by Miguel to meet her a few blocks from her house, avoiding any curious neighbors noticing unusual movement. Before leaving, she left an envelope on the table with irrelevant documents and some fake medical papers, carefully prepared to reinforce the story of the distant treatment. This would be the last physical trace Sandra would find before realizing her mother had vanished. During the flight, Evelyn felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Looking out the window, she thought about how her life was changing at that exact moment. She was leaving behind not just a house or a city, but an entire web of manipulation and financial abuse that had held her prisoner for years. At the same time, she knew her absence would trigger an immediate reaction. She could almost hear Sandra's voice on the phone demanding explanations, and Donald's calculating tone trying to turn her disappearance into an opportunity to take control of her assets. When the plane landed in Lisbon, Miguel was already there waiting. He greeted her with a firm embrace, radiating reassurance, and immediately led her to the car that would take them to Cascais. On the way, Evelyn looked out at the cobblestone streets, colorful tiles, and the sea in the distance, feeling that each kilometer traveled was another barrier between her and the past. Here, no one knew who she was, no one had expectations about what she would do with her money or her life. It was like being born again, only this time, with the experience and determination of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. When she stepped into the new apartment, simple but welcoming, Evelyn realized she was facing a blank page. For the first time in years, she had the freedom to write her own story without interference. Portugal would not be just a hiding place, it would be the setting for a planned new beginning, where she could live the days she had left with dignity, purpose, and most of all, peace. Cascais welcomed Evelyn Whitmore like an old friend who understands the weight you carry and offers silence instead of questions. From the moment she arrived, accompanied by Miguel Santos, she knew she was stepping into a completely new chapter. The apartment he had prepared was just a few steps from the sea, with a balcony where the sun rose over calm waters. Mornings were marked by the sound of waves and the smell of fresh bread from nearby bakeries. Evelyn, who for months had lived under the weight of tense appointments and calculating glances, could now start her day with a hot cup of coffee and the simple pleasure of deciding what she wanted to do. Dr. Carvalho, a renowned oncologist and Miguel's friend, received her without haste. He spoke about her pancreatic cancer not only in medical terms, but also about how to maintain quality of life. He suggested supportive therapies, light walks, and enjoyable activities as part of the treatment. Evelyn, used to associating healthcare with numbers and reports, felt unexpectedly moved by such a human approach. With Miguel, she rediscovered the pleasure of walking down cobblestone streets, visiting local markets, smelling fresh fruit, and hearing street musicians play melancholic farthus that seemed to speak directly to her soul. In time, small transformations began to show. The appetite that had disappeared in months of tension returned. Sleep, once interrupted by worries and painful memories, became deeper. The body still carried signs of illness, but her mind grew stronger each day. Evelyn set up a small home office with an ocean view, where she wrote in her diary, organized her documents, and reflected on the legacy she would leave. In Portugal, no one saw her as a walking bank account. They saw an interesting woman, with stories to tell and a smile returning more often. Sandra's calls became increasingly rare, and Evelyn replied with short, polite phrases, maintaining the narrative that she was in a distant, hard-to-visit country. This strategic distance was her shield, and Miguel was her constant ally, protecting her and ensuring nothing disturbed her new life. For the first time in a long while, she felt her decisions were entirely her own. The calm was broken when Miguel brought news from contacts in the U.S. Sandra had filed a petition to declare her mentally incompetent. The claim was predictable that pancreatic cancer and medication had impaired her judgment, making her unable to manage her own life. But Evelyn had expected this. Months earlier, Robert Steinberg had helped her build a legal wall against any such attempt. Recent reports from Dr. Carvalho confirmed not only her lucidity but also her full decision-making capacity. Robert also compiled a dossier of text messages, emails, and recordings clearly showing Sandra's interest was purely financial. These dismantled any narrative of a concerned daughter. At the same time, Portuguese lawyers were engaged to create bureaucratic barriers that would make enforcing any foreign court decision extremely difficult. But Evelyn wanted more than defense. She wanted to show she would no longer tolerate abuse. With Robert's guidance, she filed a lawsuit in the U.S. against Sandra for attempted financial exploitation, using years of records of unpaid loans, questionable transfers, and pressure for money. It was both a legal and moral blow, further weakening her daughter's credibility. Now, any attempt to approach or interfere came with the real risk of becoming further evidence against her. Even weakened legally, Sandra didn't give up. Evelyn and Miguel knew she would still look for a chance to turn the game. So they decided to act preemptively, creating an elaborate trap. The story they spread was simple. Evelyn had suffered an emotional breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric clinic outside Lisbon. The leak to Sandra came through strategic acquaintances, accompanied by convincing details like a doctor's name and address. Sandra and Donald fell for it as expected. They quickly traveled to Portugal, believing they could obtain documents proving Evelyn's supposed incapacity. But the clinic was prepared. Doctors and staff were actually actors and collaborators in the plan, and cameras recorded every move. During the visit, their invasive questions and comments about taking over the accounts were spoken naturally, unaware that every word was being recorded. When they tried to pressure the fake doctor for illegal reports, an undercover police officer intervened, revealing it was all part of an investigation. Sandra turned pale. Donald stayed silent. The collected material went to Robert, who now had undeniable proof of bad faith. The trap not only ended any chance of Sandra sustaining her story but also destroyed her reputation in legal and social circles. The invitation Evelyn Whitmore sent to Sandra and Donald was not an impulsive act, but the final, deliberate piece of a strategy she had been carefully building over time. She knew deep inside that this meeting would not simply be a conversation, it would be the moment when every mask they wore would finally fall away. Miguel Santos was entrusted with mediating the contact, ensuring the message carried both the formality and the undeniable weight the occasion demanded him in Portugal. If you want to talk, come to my home in Cascais. There is nothing to hide. It was a subtle provocation, yet charged with authority and quiet strength. On the appointed day, the Cascais sun shone brilliantly, making the distant sea sparkle like silver. Evelyn dressed impeccably, a light, elegant outfit that radiated serenity, poise, and complete control. The apartment was in flawless order, each detail deliberately arranged to project the image of a woman fully in possession of her mental faculties and utterly in command of her life. Miguel, by her side, was a quiet but commanding presence, not only her support, but her steadfast witness. When the doorbell finally rang, Evelyn drew in a deep, steady breath and opened the door. Sandra entered first, wearing the rehearsed smile Evelyn had known since childhood, though now it felt hollow and lifeless. Donald followed, carrying the calculating look of a man already weighing his next move. After a few moments of polite small talk about the weather and the city, Sandra eased into her real intent, attempting to steer the conversation toward her mother's health, her voice coated with false concern. Evelyn gave no room for maneuver. She calmly interrupted, her tone unshaken, and cut straight to the truth. You want answers? Then here they are. With measured words, she revealed she had sold her company years earlier for $8.2 million, keeping the sale secret to protect it from greed. She explained, with surgical precision, that the entire estate was legally fortified and already destined for charitable institutions, many of them in Portugal. Not a cent will go to you. Not out of revenge, but because I have seen enough to know you don't value what I built. You see me as a vault, not as a mother. The effect was immediate and undeniable. Sandra froze, as if struck by a physical blow. Donald attempted to speak of family rights and injustice, but Evelyn lifted her hand, silencing him before he could gain momentum. She declared that every attempt at manipulation, financial exploitation, and illegal guardianship had been documented, and that any further move would be met with even harsher legal consequences in both countries. Family is respect. And you lost mine a long time ago, she said, locking eyes with her daughter. A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Sandra tried to summon tears, her voice trembling in a desperate search for pity, but Evelyn's expression remained unmoved, resolute. Miguel, silent until then, stepped in only to state that from that moment forward, all contact would pass strictly through lawyers. Donald, sensing the inevitable, averted his gaze as though conceding the battle was irretrievably lost. When they finally left, there were no embraces, no farewells. The door closed, and with it, an entire cycle of manipulation and control ended. Evelyn walked to the balcony, the sea breeze caressing her face. There was no euphoria, no bitterness, only a deep, liberating peace and the certainty that she had ended the story exactly as she had always intended, in control, with dignity, and with no loose ends. Miguel brought 2 glasses of wine, and together they toasted not only to the present, but to the future Evelyn still had ahead. The door clicked shut behind Sandra and Donald, and with that sound, Evelyn felt the weight of decades of emotional strain lift from her shoulders. It was as if that final turn of the lock marked the last word of a book she herself had chosen to close. In the days that followed, news from the United States was unsurprising. Without the expectation of an inheritance, Sandra and Donald's lavish lifestyle began to collapse quickly. Debt collection letters arrived, properties were foreclosed, and valuables had to be sold. The financial strain compounded the emotional tension, and arguments that had once been kept behind closed doors spilled into the open. It wasn't long before their divorce was announced, marked by mutual accusations and bitterness. Meanwhile, in Cascais, Evelyn's life unfolded with a simple, unhurried richness. Her mornings began with the soothing sound of waves and coffee on the balcony, always shared with Miguel Santos, who had become more than a friend. He was the partner she had never imagined she would still find. They walked together to the market, greeting familiar vendors and selecting fresh ingredients to prepare meals that celebrated the joy of being alive. Dr. Carvalho continued to oversee her treatment, gently reminding her that a healthy mind and peace of spirit were just as vital as any medication. Evelyn's legacy was safe, anchored, and with a clear purpose. The chosen charities had already been informed that they would one day receive substantial support, and many had sent heartfelt letters of gratitude in advance. Knowing that her fortune would one day change lives for the better gave Evelyn a satisfaction that no amount of wealth could replace. It proved that justice is not always handed down in courtrooms. Sometimes it is shaped in the quiet, deliberate choice of where and to whom your life's work will go. In her quiet moments, Evelyn often reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the young, fearless entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing, the mother who had tried to give her daughter every opportunity, and the woman who, when faced with emotional betrayal, had found the courage to stand her ground. Pancreatic cancer was still present, but it no longer defined her. She had transformed the time she had left into a territory of freedom, where every decision was made by her for her. That night, Evelyn looked out at the moon's reflection shimmering over the sea and felt that its calm, unwavering glow mirrored her own soul. For the first time in years, there was no rush, no fear, no shadow of invisible threats lingering over her. There was only the comforting silence of someone who had won the hardest battle of all, the battle of not betraying herself. She realized that true justice is not only seeing others face the consequences of their actions, but having the chance to choose how to live even when time may be short. And with a serene, unshakable smile, she knew she had not only saved her fortune, she had saved herself. Evelyn Whitmore's story is more than a chronicle of survival. It is a living testament to courage, strategy, and self-respect. It teaches us that we do not have to quietly accept the role others try to assign us, even if those others are bound to us by blood. Evelyn proved it is possible to shatter cycles of manipulation and abuse, even when doing so demands painful and unpopular choices. More than that, she demonstrated that protecting what you've built is never selfish. It is an act of self-preservation and love. Perhaps, as you listened to this story, you remembered moments when you stayed silent to keep the peace, allowed others to make choices that should have been yours, or sacrificed your own well-being to maintain a fragile illusion of harmony. But hey, race, the truth Evelyn leaves us with: harmony without respect is only forced silence, and forced silence is its own kind of prison. It takes courage, deep, uncompromising courage, to release the ties that weaken us and to build, even late in life, the life we truly want. So now, look closely at your own story. Which decisions are you postponing because you fear someone's reaction? Who, right now, holds power over your life that should belong solely to you? And if the answer stirs discomfort, perhaps it's the clearest sign that the time has come to write a new chapter, one that belongs entirely to you. Evelyn had the audacity to change everything when everyone expected her to accept the end without resistance. You can do the same. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like it, share it with someone who needs this message, because sometimes, a single story can ignite change where silence never could. Subscribe now to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to hear more true stories of strategy, resilience, and justice. Who knows? The next story might be yours. After all, starting over is always possible, and the right time to do it will always be now.